All about the Underground Railroad, a project by Lucy Hill. What do you know about the Underground Railroad? When you hear these three words, do you imagine something similar to the London Underground or the Metro in Paris? Do you think of railway tracks and trains? Well, you would be mistaken in thinking that. In fact, the Underground Railroad has absolutely nothing to do with trains. In reality, it was the largest anti-slavery freedom movement in North America. The Underground Railroad was undoubtedly an amazing part of American history. But something that is not always mentioned is that it is an important part of Canadian history too. This video will take an in-depth look at why enslaved people who escaped via the Underground Railroad decided to journey all the way to what is now known as Canada. What advantages awaited those who came? Perhaps Canada promised freedom and more opportunities in the ways the United States simply just couldn't. So firstly, let's explore what even was the Underground Railroad. Well, in short, it was a secret network of people who had the common desire to abolish slavery. These people helped African Americans escape from enslavement in the southern states of the US, where slavery was unfortunately common practice. It was a complex network of people and safe houses that helped slaves in southern plantations reach freedom in the North and in Canada. So now that we know what it was, when did the Underground Railroad first come to be? According to the Canadian Encyclopedia, it was created in the early 19th century by a group of abolitionists based mainly in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. There were different terms for the different roles of the people involved in the Underground Railroad. The term conductors referred to people who guided runaway enslaved people, and the places that sheltered the runaways were referred to as stations. The people who hid the enslaved people were called station masters, and the fugitives traveling along the routes were called passengers. Those who had arrived at the safe houses were called cargo. An example of a station master who guided slaves to freedom in Canada is a black abolitionist named William Still. He was in charge of a station in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. So, how many people did the Underground Railroad help? Well, according to the National Geographic, between 1810 and 1850, the Underground Railroad helped to guide 100,000 enslaved people to freedom. So what was the journey to freedom actually like for the slaves who were trying to escape to freedom? Some may wonder about the dangers slaves faced when escaping via the Underground Railroad. These are very pertinent questions, as it was extremely dangerous for the people who decided to run away. In the unfortunate circumstance a fugitive was caught, they could be taken back to their masters and severely hurt or even killed. The people who helped them could also be physically abused or even killed. It was very difficult for those who decided to leave because many people would have to cope with the fact that they were leaving their families behind and they would not know when they would see them again. Those who left faced possible re-enslavement and very harsh punishments from the slave catchers. So what states would slaves travel through? Most of the enslaved people helped by the Underground Railroad escaped to border states such as Kentucky, Virginia, and Maryland. They would often have to travel through the night, and typically there were no maps available to them. Slaves would travel either by themselves or in small groups. Many would have no food, clothes, or money. Getting to freedom meant traveling hundreds of miles across land and river by foot or boat or wagon. If they were lucky, they could travel with a conductor who would help guide them. Many of the operators of the Underground Railroad were members of organized groups that helped runaways, such as the Quaker religion. These operators used their homes, churches, and barns as stations. There, fugitives could stop and receive shelter, food, protection, and perhaps money. A man called Levi Coffin, who was a religious Quaker and opposed slavery, made his home in Indiana a station. More than 3,000 slaves passed through there, heading north to Canada. So this leads into the reason why many slaves traveled via the Underground Railroad to Canada. So the reason many enslaved black people headed for Canada was due to Fugitive Slave Acts. Essentially, an act was passed in 1793 that allowed local governments in the states to extradite escaped slaves even if they were living in free states. The law also punished anyone helping the fugitives, thus making it very dangerous for slaves to escape. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 was designed to strengthen the previous law in 1793. This led to northern states posing a risk for slaves. So meanwhile, further north, Canada offered black people the freedom to live where they wanted. In fact, some Underground Railroad operators based themselves in Canada and worked to help the arriving fugitives settle in. According to the Canadian Encyclopedia, an estimated 30,000 to 40,000 slaves entered Canada via the Underground Railroad. So who are the main people involved in the Underground Railroad? Well, countless people were involved, but just for some quick examples, abolitionists like William Still, Levi Coffin, Thomas Garrett, and of course the infamous Harriet Tubman helped slaves escape to freedom. We can't really talk about the Underground Railroad without at least briefly mentioning Harriet Tubman. She was one of the most influential people who was part of the Underground Railroad. She was an enslaved woman who escaped herself via the Underground Railroad. She traveled 100 miles to freedom from Maryland to Pennsylvania. She went on to become the Underground Railroad's most famous conductor, embarking on about 13 rescue operations and pulling out at least 70 enslaved people. She was a truly amazing woman. Finally, let's speak about the legacy of the slaves who came to Canada. So slaves who reached what is now known as Canada migrated to various parts of what is now known as Ontario, New Brunswick, Quebec, and Nova Scotia. No matter what province they settled in, Black Canadians helped build strong communities and contributed to the development of the provinces in which they lived and worked. According to the Canadian Encyclopedia, those who migrated operated various businesses such as grocery stores, blacksmith shops, saw company, pharmacies, carpentry businesses, as well as Toronto's first taxi company. Now, although Canada promised freedom, Black Canadians still faced discrimination and racism. They faced segregation in schools and difficulties finding homes, jobs, etc. Despite the racism they faced, many Black communities continued to fight for racial equality. Within their communities, they founded schools, churches, etc. The basic idea of the Underground Railroad was for people to come together to help bring freedom to those who were enslaved. Canada offered that freedom. Undeniably, the journey to freedom was extremely difficult, and the Underground Railroad was a pivotal part of American and Canadian history. It represents how people can come together to fight for equality for everyone, and the people who are involved in the Underground Railroad prove that justice is worth fighting for. The slaves who came to Canada built a long-lasting legacy and contributed to the economic growth of this country. Their fight for freedom helped pave the way for their descendants and helped Canada become a freer, fairer country that strives to accept and provide a home for everyone. Thank you for watching. I hope you learned a bit about how important the Underground Railroad was in Canadian history.